Welcome. My name is Shamtoli Haq. I'm the editor of Law at the Margins. For those who are unfamiliar with our work, Law at the Margins is a media organization. We curate social justice content geared towards change makers. Today, we're very excited to have a panel of organizers and experts to talk about domestic violence, interpersonal violence, and gender-based violence. Uh, I would like to introduce Margarita Guzman, who will be moderating today's webinar. She's the Executive Director of Violence Intervention Program, and she will introduce our panelists. Just a little bit of logistics. Those of you who are joining us, please introduce yourselves. I'll be chatting with you throughout the webinar. Add your questions in the chat box. After the presentations, we will take the questions from each of you. And we're looking forward to a great discussion. So with that, Law the Margins is co-sponsoring this with VIP Mujeres, SOAR for Justice, as well as Saki for South Asian Women. The program is also a collaborative effort with our panelists, and I'm looking forward to hearing them. So with that, thank you so much, Margarita. If you can introduce our panelists and get us going.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you again to all the organizers. This is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and it's been a pretty tumultuous month at that. We are witnessing intensified attacks on the validity of survivor experiences, the value of immigrant lives, and the dignity of all people of color. And there's a lot at stake with the pending renewal of the Violence Against Women Act and elections that are coming up in just a week and a half. So for today's discussion, we brought together panelists from communities. So you're going to be hearing from Salim MacNichol, who's the co-executive director at Connect New York, which strives to help change the beliefs, behaviors, and institutions that perpetuate violence. Through legal empowerment, grassroots mobilization, and transformation education, Connect seeks to create safe families and peaceful communities. Sally, do you want to wave? We are also joined by Nancy Albalal, President and CEO, and Danny Salim, Director at the Arab American Family Support Center, an organization that provides culturally and linguistically specific services to low-income immigrant communities. AAFSC empowers new immigrants with the tools they need to successfully acclimate to the world around them and become active participants in their communities. As Chamtole mentioned, my name is Margarita Guzman. I'm going to be moderating this discussion and jumping in every now and again. I'm the executive director of the Violence Intervention Program, which is a Latinx-led organization that provides culturally specific services to survivors and advocates for systemic and social change to eradicate intimate partner and sexual violence here in New York City. So in planning this discussion, we wanted to honor the gains that we have made with really big legislation like VAWA. And more importantly, we really wanted to engage in an honest and even uncomfortable conversation about the intersections of gender justice and anti-racist movements. We want to have a really profoundly honest conversation about the limitations of VAWA, especially for immigrants and communities of color. And we really want to explore community-driven solutions that might offer options and alternatives to state-based interventions. And I want to also be clear that as in the design of this discussion, decided not to necessarily come as experts, right? We're having this conversation as community members and leaders who think it's really time to have honest discussions about these issues. And so this will be a lively discussion. We really welcome all of your comments on the side so that we can incorporate it into some of the answers that we give, and also we'll have some time set aside at the end to answer any questions that we can't get to along the way, okay? Is there anything else that the panelists would like to add to finish framing the conversation? Okay, great. So let's begin with a really brief overview of VAWA and what it has given us. And don't worry, I'm going to keep the legalese. This brief summary is actually thanks to our partners at Legal Momentum, and you can see a fuller, more detailed history of VAWA on their website at legalmomentum.org. So Congress passed the Violence Against Women Act of 1994 as part of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. In its original enactment, VAWA was designed to improve criminal justice responses to domestic violence and to increase the availability of services to those victims. The protections and provisions afforded by the 1994 legislation were subsequently expanded in the year 2000. In 2000, VAWA expanded to include protections for battered immigrants, sexual assault survivors, and victims of dating violence. And as you might guess, the language that I'm using is language that was used in those original acts. So language like battered immigrants was not language that I just selected. It enabled domestic violence victims who flee across state lines to obtain custody orders without returning to jurisdictions where they may be in danger, and improved enforcement of protection orders across state and tribal lines. So it was really important that there be full faith and credit to the orders of protections that people were getting in one jurisdiction if they were moving to another jurisdiction to be able to enforce those. VAWA in 2005 continued to improve upon or expand those laws by providing an increased focus on access to services for communities of color, immigrant women, and tribal and Native communities and LGBTQ communities. New programs under VAWA 2005 included the court training and improvements, child witness, and culturally specific programs. So since 1994, OVW, the Office on Violence Against Women, which administers these grants, has awarded nearly $4 billion in VAWA grant funds to state, tribal, and local governments, nonprofit organizations focused on ending violence against women, and universities. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, signed into law on February 19, 2009, includes an additional $225 million for OVW to combat the legacy of laws and social norms that long served to justify violence against women. So that was just a really brief overview of what the law did and the time frame within which it did it. But I would like to ask Danny Salim from Arab American Family Support Center to help us understand what all of that means on the ground. What do VAWA-funded programs look like? And Danny, if you want to start with what they look like at Arab American, that would be great.
Great. Thank you so much, Margarita. So under VAWA, currently, survivors of domestic violence, they have access to criminal legal advocacy, civil legal advocacy, health services, and social services. So under the criminal legal advocacy, they have access to resources such as police, they have access to prosecutors. Under civil legal advocacy, they do have access to resources in family court, such as order of protection and custody relief. Under the health services, they do have access to hospitals, therapists, clinicians, and including physical and emotional support and services. And also under social services, they do have access to everyday life needs resources such as temporary financial assistance, temporary housing, shelters, and public assistance and other needs as needed. So at the Arab American Family Support Center, we do provide a lot of advocacy in terms of civil legal, and do provide the social services advocacy in terms of providing culturally competent and trauma-informed services to survivors and assisting them in cases management and crisis intervention.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Teddy. Sally, is there anything that you would want to add?
Well, just something that I heard, some numbers that I think are interesting. That in terms of criminal legal system funding under VAWA, they went to criminal legal, and the funding that went to social services. I learned this from Lee Goodmark, who I'm recommending her book to everyone. Her book coming out. But in 1994, 38% of the funding went to social services and 62% went to the criminal legal system. And in 2013, 85% to criminal legal and 15% to social services. So over the time, I believe it's accurate to say that more funding went directly to criminal legal and less to social services. Yes.
Thank you. And can you, is there any way that Connect themselves have been able to provide services based on VAWA funding? What does the VAWA funding look like for Connect?
Actually, we don't have that.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I'll also be transparent about the Violence Intervention Program, which in that final iteration, that 2005 iteration, which started allocating money for culturally specific services, that's when VIP was able to benefit from some funding that would help us to provide services to Latina, predominantly immigrant survivors of intimate partner and sexual assault.
I forgot to mention something though, but we used to be part of a grant from OBS that was directed toward, and it's still going on in New York, but it was to help deaf and hard of hearing survivors to get services, get more access to services. So
thank you.
That's one thing.
Thank you. And Danny, did you want to say anything additional, or Nancy, about the impact that those services have had on immigrant survivors especially?
Where does one start? These services serve as a safety net for many of the populations that we are serving, because for many of us in the nonprofit sector, community-based organization, we serve as a safety net, as a trusted entity for many of these families. So it's very difficult for family members to go to a government and ask for services. We serve as a conduit for many of these services, and a safe place in which they could come to us and seek those services without judgment, without penalty, without any way in which they get penalized for accessing these services.
Right. So thank you. And I want to just quote, there's just been, that is all to say, this has been a tremendous landmark legislation that has provided so many resources in social service provision, and as Sally was mentioning earlier, in criminal legal response to intimate partner violence. So there's been rich and really important work that has come of VAWA. But I'd like to quote a paragraph from a study done by the MIDS Foundation in 2003 called Safety and Justice for All, referencing the VAWA successes. And it's, most intimate partner violence is not reported to the police. A striking 4/5 of all rapes, 3/4 of all physical assaults, and 1/2 of all stalking perpetrated against women are not reported to the police. These findings suggest that many victims of intimate partner violence do not consider the justice system an appropriate intervention. Despite the great need, as evidenced by long waiting lists at many battered women's shelters and sexual violence programs, a large percentage of women never turn to service organizations. While shelters, crisis services, and legal remedies are crucial for those who choose to or are able to access them, the movement knows very little about the far greater number of women who instead utilize more informal helping networks. So the question I have for the panel is, if VAWA has done so much to support this work over the past 25 years, why are so many people, and especially communities of color and immigrants, still not accessing those services? And Sally, would you mind getting us started on discussing that question?
Yeah. I think I first want to say that for many people, even who have gone to access services provided by VAWA, there always have been good outcomes. I think, yes, it's very important for some people, but also for other people, the outcomes aren't good. And recognize that because VAWA is really.
Sorry, it's hard to
I'm
hear
going to
you, right?
interrupt really quick, Sally. I'm so sorry. Can you repeat? I'm going to ask you to just start over and maybe speak into your microphone so that we can hear you a little bit more clearly.
Oh.
And it might be the technology as well. So be patient with us.
Okay, so
you again.
Can you hear me now?
I hear you better now.
My phone rings on my computer. So I just wanted to say that before turning to the reasons why VAWA, many people don't see resources and access, the resources of VAWA provides. Many people who do seek, criminal legal remedies for their situation, and all the supports that we've mentioned, those aren't in and of themselves always good. People have difficult times in court with systems. So that feeds into the people who hear about those problems, like the potential. In our context, one of the greatest fears that people have and that makes them not want to access systems is the fear of the child welfare folks. People are extremely afraid, and I've worked for a long time, and those narratives about your children being taken away, and even though we had the Nicholson case here, it's still a very, very fearful situation for many women who have children. So that's just starting there broadly. Another place that's, I guess we all understand that the police are not trusted in many communities, communities of color that are here in this country, and communities of color that have come from other countries. The situation around immigration right now, but I mean, the fear is really overwhelming out there in our experience. So people definitely, just the fear of police brutality. I was working with someone whose cousin called the police, 911. Her husband was drunk and throwing stuff around, and she was scared. She called the police, and her husband ended up dead. And so just though even that reverberates, people hear those stories, not to mention all the other kinds of police brutality. So there's a lot of fear around that. And then just an example, there's maybe a case that I'll quickly say that gives an example of a young woman who's come from, I don't want to give the name of the country, but Central American country. She's come here, she's 23. She's living with a cousin who, her cousin's, it's a very crowded apartment. Her cousin's husband makes her very uncomfortable. She's suffered some sexual trauma along the way already. She meets an older man who's from her country, very kind. He's a citizen, he has a steady job, he has an apartment. He starts taking her to his church where she feels some sense of belonging that she hasn't had. And they get married, and the control, what was attentiveness, and the control starts, and he won't help her do her papers, and she's too terrified. That's an example of someone who would be too terrified to reach out and to even know what kinds of resources would be there for her. So, a hallmark of the domestic violence movement in this iteration, these last 30, 40 years, was that we were supposed to listen to survivors and to hear what they wanted. And many people want the abuse to stop. Many people do not want because of many, many different reasons, do not want to split up with a person who's abusive to them. And we haven't heard that. We haven't made other alternatives where people can seek help and safety, for their situation. There's so many people live such deeply complex lives, and the narrative around domestic violence is pretty simple. You go to court, you go to shelter, the person goes to jail, and that is just not realistic or connected to people's lives. So, I'm glad we're having this conversation so we can move into some other creative ways of responding. But are there I know people have lots to say. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to just add a little bit before I turn it over to Nancy and Danny to contribute. But just wanted to, because VIP works with predominantly Latinx immigrants, a lot of our survivors crossing the border. Yeah. And so very often their very first experience of this country is the state violence enacted by immigration services on the border. And those who are lucky get past that and then have to build out a life in the United States, trying to stay off the radar of that violent institution or what they experienced as violence coming through. So there is not just a fear of what might happen, there's an experience, right, a lived experience of state violence that is really driving people away from anything that might put them in touch with that violence again. And that is something that even when people reach out for assistance or are looking for community in some way, whatever language you want to use, they're looking for something that validates and might help heal or help them move forward on healing from those experiences. There is something that is never going to feel connected to a criminal, legal, or immigration response because they've already experienced violence from that place. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to note that, and just also to lift up what Sally was saying about how very intentional the voices of which survivors we've chosen to listen to as we build out all of these programs and as we rework and cooperate with state responses, because we have chosen not to listen to all those survivors, right? And I read those stats from that report earlier, and Sally offered the vast majority of people experiencing this violence are people whose voices we're not listening to when they say they don't want to access those systems. And we're like, no, really, we're going to make these systems more accountable for you. We're going to make them better. We're going to make police enforcement anti-racist. We're going to make immigration pro-immigrant. So when we say those things and when that's our strategy, what we're really doing is we're not investing in what strategies might be possible when we hear the voices of the majority of people experiencing intimate partner and sexual violence and what strategies might come from that. And I want to also offer time for Danny and Nancy to give any response to this particular question, like why aren't immigrants and communities of color accessing these services?
So if I may offer a little bit about context, for most of us who grew up in an extended family have memories that we have with cousins, spending time with cousins and grandparents and our aunts and uncles. For the majority of the world, the extended family serves as a safety net for children and their parents. The extended family members serve as extra support when the family is in crisis. They help make lasting memories when in cases of domestic violence situation in the home or in divorce or separation happens. Children have extra family members for love and affection. Also, extended family can provide stability and continuity for children as they going through a difficult situation. However, when that safety net is taken away due to war happening in countries, families getting separated, a travel ban, not allowing families to unite, and the government and its various systems cannot be suitable for the extended family or be the best safety net for individuals in crisis. Especially when government officials or policymakers do not see members of that family or members of that group, immigrant populations in particular, people of color in particular, as equal or deserving of humanity or compassion. This is especially harmful when members of the family belong to that particular group that's being targeted. In today's environment, immigrants, new immigrants, refugees, and people of color are feeling more marginalized than ever before. They, by the acts and words of our leaders and the policies that are imposed on them. So for many vulnerable populations, community-based organizations are the closest thing to having the extended family nearby. They see us as a trusted source for information, for referral, for services, and they seek us out. However, it is important for us to emphasize to them that we are not going to report them. There's tremendous fear. They're going to be reported to government if they have conflict in the home. Is the government going to force the families to be separated? All these things put pressure on the families to see us or not see us. In these circumstances, it's very important for us to educate the family members, the community at large, what kind of services we could offer them. It is important for us to understand that we are going to be respecting their culture, their traditions. We're going to speak their language. They're going to seek our services for those reasons. And more importantly, amplifying their voices and their choices. With such trust comes a responsibility for a community-based organization. We need to shine light on what is working, what's not working. In the systems that we are offering them or the systems that they could actually access. We need to let the public know that there are some things that work and don't work based on the rules and regulations that we are abiding by, the systems that we are interacting with. We have to do a careful assessment of what works. And what works is including families in the decision-making process. What works is that families need to take responsibility. I am a strong believer that it takes a village to support families, to support individuals within the families, but someone ought to be responsible, and that someone ought to be responsible parents. That responsibility falls on the parents, and we need to empower parents to make sure that children have all the resources that they need to succeed. So there are elements of the system that works, and there are elements that don't work. And when those elements do not work, we need to be the voice of our clients, be the voice of our community members. We need to be the advocates of those elements that do work and do not work.
Great. Thank you so
So I
much.
would like
Oh, go on ahead, Danny. Yes, please. Thank you.
to what Nancy just said, that last year in 2017, approximately there are daily 224 calls made to the hotline. And so under VAWA, there's currently the survivors or victims have access to domestic violence hotline 24/7. So although this number might seem very high, 224, it still does not convey all the cases that we work with. It does not convey all. It does not reach all the people that we have interacted with or that we try to reach to. And for many reasons that some of that already mentioned, and some of that we are trying to identify. And part of it, what Nancy mentioned, is working with the whole family, addressing the root causes, empowering meeting people where they are. And so the fear that currently exists would result in people not coming forward, people not reporting the abuse because of they feel, for some, they feel that they don't have a say in the process.
Right. Thank you so much for that. And there's sort of a couple comments on the side and from people who joined us on the webinar that I want to incorporate in our conversation. And just to be responsive to what you said, Danny, what's interesting then is that it's that data, right? The data of the people who do access traditional state-based services that then becomes the basis for advocacy around gaining more resource and reinvesting more resources into those very services. So in some ways it ends up being a really self-serving cycle without, to Nancy's point, thinking about all of the people who are accessing assistance not through those means and specifically going to culturally specific organizations that will never report that necessarily or aren't going to make it to those data points. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that as one of the ways that unrepresentative data set then becomes the mainstream strategy for addressing these issues. And Siswan, I believe from IRC, was noting also, and I think this is an important thing for us to articulate here, is that very often women of color and trans and gender nonconforming people, when they do call the police, it's not just unintended consequences for the abusive partner that they're worried about, it's unintended consequences for them, right? Like we are far more likely to be arrested when we call for help than white cisgender heteronormative survivors might be when they call for help. So it's not just unintended consequences for the abusive partner, it's also for the person who is experiencing that violence. And I wanted to name that. And then Susan Gambler had also offered a comment about the impact on children. So from that, quoting from that same article, that Ms. Foundation article that I had quoted earlier on safety and justice for all, I'd love to turn the conversation to the intergenerational impact of this heavy reliance on state-based responses. And the quote there is, extensive adult interference with the criminal, civil, and family court systems, such as those described above, has enormous implications for children. Poor children and children of color are placed in foster care or otherwise tracked within the child welfare system in significant numbers. And that's a national sort of commentary. It's not specific to any particular jurisdiction or community. But given that premise, I would love to hear a little bit about the impact of systems involved systems involved children. And Nancy, I'm wondering, since you were already speaking to the way that immigrant and communities of color might rely on family and extended family in really significant ways to address violence, if you can speak to that first before other panelists jump in on the impact on children.
I think no one is advocating that if there is violence in the home to give what needs to happen in situations like that is that the counseling that needs to take place, the advice, the suggestion, the planning needs to take into consideration the entire family, especially when we know survivors of domestic violence go back to their abusers because they're depending on them for their livelihood, their well-being in terms of economic well-being, and also for immigrant women in particular, their immigration status. We need to take that into consideration. There are many circumstances in which the survivors come to us at the Family Justice Center, and ultimately they change their mind about pressing charges against uh, their uh, their abusers. Why is that? We need to take into consideration why are they not pressing charges, and why are they not pressing charges as we dig deeper. It's because their immigration status is not stable, their economic situation is not stable, their housing situation is not stable. It could be under some circumstances in the family members, the extended family members back in their homeland may be threatened by the extended family members of the abusers. On and on and on, you name it. We need to understand that any services, any intervention that we offer, or any suggestion that we offer, needs to take the family as a whole and their circumstances. In some situations, we have programs that are totally opposite to one another in terms of philosophy. For example, in our DV program, the emphasis is always on the children and the survivors. But in our preventive services, the emphasis is on the family as a whole. So in situations like that where there is DV and there is child abuse in the home, how does one respond? And how does one respond in that situation? We take into consideration the children first and foremost in terms of their well-being, but the parents second, and that is especially the parent that is taking care of the child, and ultimately the family as a whole, in that we make sure that we are providing appropriate services to the family as a whole. If someone has mental health issues and challenges, we treat the individual, but also we take into consideration the family as a whole. How could everyone be of service? And that means also we are addressing community challenges regarding mental health and stigma and abuse and neglect and healthy and unhealthy relationships. One has to tackle this situation from different angles, directly with the individual that's impacted, with the on the side of caution, making sure that the children are not being harmed, the survivors are not being harmed any further, and also building on that by having healing circles, having them participate in support, group support, and all kinds of services that need to build the capacity and strengthen the family as a whole.
Right. Thank you. It's really wonderful to hear, Nancy, about the ways that Arab American Family Support Center, in that culturally specific context, is creating programming that is addressing families as a whole. Because the part of the quote and sort of the theory from that, or the practice from that, is that systems are not, right? Systems are thinking in ways that are really incident-based and individual-based, and not thinking about families and communities necessarily, and in fact are really harmful to those communities. And the quote was very general, but I quickly looked up for New York City, and I could only find in that short time some statistics from 2014 about our own foster care system. And in 2014, 95% of all children in foster care were children of color, right? So 5% of all the children in foster care in New York City were white children. That's 536 compared to 10,118 children of color that were in foster care. And I wanted to ask Sally, because I can see you shaking your head and feelings, to share those feelings about that.
Well, and just to recognize that not only are children of color, you know, the largest number of children in foster care, but the statistics also show that they stay longer in foster care.
That's it. I'm sorry, Sally, do you mind speaking a little bit more to the microphone? My apologies. I'm going to make you like get up in the...
I'm sorry.
You're great. You're good.
Children of color also stay longer in foster care, get less services, and we have to remember that foster care is a very dangerous place for children. And the 40% chance of getting sexually abused while you're in foster care is one of the statistics that I have. The fact that there's no screening in foster care for domestic violence or foster care. So it's a very, very, very dangerous system. You know, I remember someone that I worked with who was an advocate also, who said to me that if she had been removed from her mother, who was being married by her father, she said if she had been removed, she would not have had the resilience to get through it, even though sometimes she was in danger. But she said that removal would have shattered her sense of wholeness. And I think that always stuck with me very deep, because I think we have to honor attachments. I mean, of course, safety is critical, but we have to create other ways to honor the attachment between children and their parents.
Right. And I think I'm so sorry, Sally. I
didn't placing children in foster homes where in that home their language of origin is not spoken, their tradition is not honored or respected, or they are not, they feel alienated, isolated, they're in an unfamiliar place. It's very detrimental to the children, where especially when we're looking at new immigrants and refugees, or Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, South Asian population. There aren't enough foster parents who speak the language, who comes from the tradition of the kids that will be placed. So those are some of the critical issues that we also have to be aware of and conscientious about. The other thing is that also when women, a survivor, and the child goes to a shelter, when that shelter does not feel safe to them, they can't practice their religion, they can't pray, there is no, they're looked at weird if they try to pray in that place. They don't have halal food, on and on and on, you name it. It becomes super duper difficult, and therefore the survivors feel like, what choice do I have? What options do I have? That's why it's important for us to consider what we're recommending, what we're offering, what we're suggesting in terms of alternatives for the clients.
And also, I would like to add that currently, there have been a lot of efforts to help survivors, and there have been a lot of success stories. We would like to acknowledge that. However, for the communities that we serve, there are some challenges and some gaps that it's hard to address, and it's not been fully addressed. And part of it is providing a holistic approach for the whole family. And that holistic approach, like Nancy mentioned, sometimes when the survivor doesn't want to go to the shelter, chooses to just stay at home, and for many reasons, the abuser, after the expiration of the order of protection, would go back home, and for reasons that might be bringing the family together, for reasons that might be financial, for many reasons that sometimes it's hard to understand. But addressing that holistic approach, providing the family that choose to be in that situation and survivor, and helping them lead the process, helping them become empowered to really choose the way that they want to meet them where they are. And it is a key in any process. And providing an additional option to what we currently have in the system, not mainly the legal system where the survivor will come to us. This is what we have for you. You can file for order of protection. Sometimes there are limitations for the order of protection, especially when the survivor would choose to go back home, and especially if there is a limited order of protection. And in one case that I would like to briefly share is where it was a highly complicated case where the whole family was involved. And so we have the mother-in-law, we have the daughter-in-law, and we have the husband. And then it was challenging because how many orders of protection you can get? You know, you can get against the mother-in-law, you can get against the husband, and then it becomes messy when everyone living in the same house. And then that kind of a challenge when we could not do an early intervention or prevention, and that what is missing, to do the prevention, early intervention before we get to the crisis intervention, before we get to the crisis, before we get to the just providing the family was okay, that's what we have for you. You either choose to go with the legal option or we don't have anything else.
Right. Sally, did you want to?
Oh, I just to follow a little bit on what Nancy said. In another context, I wanted to just make sure that people knew about this documentary called Dawnland that's about the Wabanaki people in Maine and their experiences with child welfare. And it's going to be on PBS on November 5th.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
It speaks to the same kind of, I mean, it's a very difficult, horrendous situation that actually Maine has, the state of Maine has, thanks to the Wabanaki people coming to them, has worked on. But similarly, you know, putting children in foster care where their identity is ripped to shreds. So,
right. And I just, so we're going ahead. I'm sorry, Sally, finish.
No, go ahead. We'll get to it.
I was just going to say, and to circle back to the sort of VAWA theme that we began with, I think it's so important for organizations like ours, the Violence Intervention Program, and you can offer whether this is true for your programs as well. I believe it's probably true for many of the people who are listening in. The structures governing our support and provision of services makes us complicit in engaging with state services and state responses in ways like making us mandated reporters, right? This is actually my first time at an organization where that's a part of what I work on. I have been an attorney, so my confidentiality has always been, you know, really different. But stepping into these roles, and now that I'm more enmeshed in social service provision, it's so clear to see how these services really all link back to state-based investment and what they get out of it, which is that we then have to make sure that our services are linked to them somehow through this mandated reporting requirement. And it, you know, like, and when we talk about some of the gains made, which are so important, can't undermine how important it is for people to be able to get their U visas, their T visas, their battered spouse waivers through the legislation at VAWA. Those are also, especially UNT visas, all based on prosecution or investigation of some kind. So cooperation with the state is a requisite for you to be able to access that benefit as an immigrant who's experienced violence. And so the state inserts itself in all of these ways that make not just, you know, so we were talking at the beginning how that, you know, really alienates the majority of people experiencing this violence, especially immigrants and women of color, communities of color. But this is the way that it makes organizations complicit in that process. So that, I think, is part of the discomfort that we really have to address as organizations doing this work. And I just wanted to sort of bring that conversation round with why that impact from ACS and Child Protective Services generally can end up being so insidious and so harmful. You know, family separation has been a process that this government has been invested in for years and years. Since we began, right? Since this government was established, family separation was something that they practiced. When slavery was practiced, it was practiced to break apart indigenous nations. And this, what we're seeing now, is not new. It is a continuation of that invested strategy by U.S. government. So our engagement with it and our goals to try to shift these conversations is really important. And I think we just had a technical failure with Sally, who'll join us in a second. But she had started to bridge the conversation by mentioning that PBS special that was going to be highlighting the work of Indigenous cultures in Maine about community-based responses. And we want to spend the rest of our time talking about that and then leave some time for questions about what is, so if we are seeing a need for different types of programming and different responses outside of criminal legal responses. And given the unintended consequences of system involvement, that's a real fact for the majority of survivors. Let's shift our discussion to that exploratory part of the convo and ask what community-driven approaches have already evolved alongside of or even outside of the responses. And did Sally join us yet? Hi, Sally. Welcome back. So I'm just going to repeat my question, which is what community-driven approaches have evolved alongside of or outside of legal responses? And I'm going to open that to whoever would like to respond first.
I think you have to assign.
That's a big question. And we just lost Sally, so you win. Go.
Okay,
Either Danny or Nancy.
Yeah.
Well, I could tell you that early intervention, like working with our youth program, works as a preventive kind of measure. We have a curriculum called the Healthy Relationship Curriculum that we are implementing with our youth at schools, in the community.
And I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Nancy, but because of the time limitations, I wanted to ask if you can speak about, in addition to the prevention and early intervention, you can also make sure you give yourself time to talk about any interventions in or responses to intimate partner and sexual violence as you're discussing that. So my apologies for interrupting you.
Yeah, and so what we're doing is focusing or implementing the curriculum as a preventive measure, so that we are providing our youth with education and resources so that to teach them about who they are, their culture, and the way in which healthy relationships are promoted or exemplified. For example, many of the kids that we interact with, they said, well, that's our tradition in that we are supposed to be, the man is the patriarch and the head of the household. And our way is supposed to be the way of our culture. And we have to actually teach them about their own culture. What does that mean? We emphasize the issue of a man in a situation like that, or a healthy man is, yes, head of the household, but also the woman is the head of the household. And the person that's the head of the household is supposed to promote peace, harmony, be the protector, be the provider, be the loving, caring, gentle person that they ought to be for their family members, for their children, for their partner. Those are the things that are also part of the culture and part of the religion and part of the element that makes you a good human being. That's the way is supposed to be practiced. So to chuck it up to that's the way the culture is, no, we have to separate myths and misconceptions. What is practiced versus what is promoted as culture versus non-culture, religion versus non-religion.
And also, I'd like to add that considering currently that the current system is very limited in addressing the needs of our communities, I think there is a need to really add an additional options that we could provide the people that seek our services, that we could provide our community additional restorative justice option that would honor their experience, that would consider their traditions and practices, that would when Nancy mentioned that the extended family member is sometimes might be a challenge for the survivor. And so in implementing restorative justice practices as an additional option would include involving working with the whole family, extended family member as approved by the survivor. It would entail honoring the voice of the survivor and not pressuring the survivor, and providing that option for the survivor as an additional service that currently does not exist or might exist that we're trying to implement in a way, but there are challenges in implementing that service. So as Nancy mentioned, sometimes we have two programs. One is a DV program, one is the child welfare program. In the DV program, we mainly work with the survivor. In the child welfare program, actually they work with the whole family. But in that work, again, there is a need to implement the art restorative justice practice, not just to go with what we're doing with the current system, because we need to work around it holistically to really address the root causes of why we're here and involve the parties with the approval of the survivor as well, and with the option of providing that option as being voluntarily for the survivor and not pressuring anyone to take any option.
Right. Thank you.
I think that also when we're talking about holistic, I don't know, there's an echo when I'm talking.
Mm-hmm. It's fine.
But part of that holistic response, and this is the hard part, and the part that is very, very underfunded also, which is the family is in a community, and the community, we sometimes romanticize different, the word community gets very vague, but there are also community norms that have to be transformed, and so it's the work of alternative responses also includes working with communities and promoting, raising up the community leaders who might not have a voice. There are always community leaders that are invisible and doing a lot of work. And we do a lot of work with faith communities because we know that many of the people we work with, that's going to be their first response. In fact, I see Suzanne Gamblers on this call today, webinar today, as an example of someone who's built a ministry in her community where people can go first and, seek out be in a trusted place. And for many people coming from other countries, their first place of belonging is going to be in their faith community. And, and we don't want to romanticize that community because we know there are a lot of issues there. But in other words, a holistic response is like it's like a, it goes from the individual, family, community, it has to be in depth in that way and really liberating out.
To just to offer, because we a couple of different languages or sort of phrases I heard that I want to offer up some definitions and framework around, and would ask the panelists to please jump in if you think anything about this framework is missing. But when we talk about restorative justice, we also sometimes hear transformative justice, and then we also sometimes hear community accountability practices. And those are kind of the three biggest categories that we hear a lot about when it comes to community-driven solutions to intimate or interpersonal violence of all kinds. And I wanted to offer up definitions. This is from the Just Practice Collaborative, and this is work largely done by Miriam Kaba and Shaira Hassan through their work at the Just Practice Collaborative or Collective, sorry, Just Practice Collective. So I want to make sure that I give credit where credit is due, because I frankly feel like we had gone through so many different iterations of language, and it was so great to hear this framework. It helped me very much to get my head around these ideas. And so what they offer for restorative justice is that restorative justice focuses on the harmed party and repairing the harm, right? So it focuses on restoring the community through healing. And healing is really centered in that practice. What is different from the processes that we currently have through criminal legal responses is that healing is rarely a part of what we're trying to achieve. It's what we're trying to achieve as community members, as advocates, as activists. It's not what the system is trying to achieve. The system is trying to achieve punishment and retribution, and they call it accountability, right? For the harm that was caused. It's a real focus on the person who caused the harm in that interesting way that is to say that person needs to be punished without a whole lot being done for the person who experienced the harm. So restorative justice focuses on restoring the community through healing. And transformative justice, which might use restorative justice practices, is concerned about addressing the roots of violence and transforming conditions, right? For transformative justice, and this is to what Sally was just speaking, restoration is not enough, right? We have to look further to see what it is we're able to do to transform communities to address this issue. And with community accountability, the definition that was offered is a set of practices that are developed by a group of connected people. So whatever, the word community can be really overused sometimes too. Like, what does community even mean anymore, right? Is it my geographic community? Is it my queer or LGBTQ community? Is it my Chicana community? Is it a community of women, trans, gender nonconforming people? What does that mean? So community can be defined in many ways, but community accountability practices, set of practices developed by a group of connected people to respond to and heal from and or transform harm. So I wanted to offer up that framework for the conversation because I found it really helpful. And to kind of come back to the restorative justice conversation, because that's a phrase we've heard the most amount of buzz around. And Danny, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but since it first came out of your mouth, I wanted to know if we could offer the folks on the webinar solid examples of what a restorative justice process might look like. And that's open to everybody. I didn't mean to put you super on the spot.
Yeah. I could start. So
thank you.
What I'd like to say, just going back to the definitions that you provided and going back to mentioning the holistic approach and additional options. So not just putting the name tag on it, this is restorative justice, this is transformative justice, this is community accountability. Actually, it would be great if we could open it up. This is the criminal justice, this is restorative justice, this is the community accountability, and then provide that option to the person that's seeking services. That's what I want. This is the option that I need. So it's not that we only have, this is the option that we have for you, especially we work with a community that's highly diverse. We work in New York City, and I don't want to say how many communities are in New York City, how many languages are in New York City. So it's not that we have this set of practices that we could provide. Actually, ideally is to have all these practices in place where a person can come and say, this does not work for me for these reasons, and there are many reasons, and it takes a lot of time and to build that trust with a person to tell you and to open up to say why this option does not work for me. Whether it's mistrust, whether it's family pressure, whether it's community pressure, it takes time. So providing all these options on the table and having the person choose from these options would be ideal and would be very beneficial. And that's what we could call a holistic approach, not just providing one option. Going back to restorative justice, again, OLB has to be voluntary. We can't pressure anyone to take any option. We can't pressure anyone to be in any place, considering their safety, considering their self-determination, without them being wanting to be in that place. And then it requires circuit processes, and that circuit processes could be separate with the healing circles for the survivor, and healing circles and other circles for the person that caused the harm. And also there could be additional circles when the people are ready to be in that space, if they want to be in that space, if they want to come to the table, if they want to. There should not be any pressure on any person along the process. Then we could talk about the people talking, and especially if the person is already in the home, they're still living together, and they're still living in the same family, and the children is still in the home. The whole family, extended family members, are still being involved in that family.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to add something to that, Sally, before?
No, only just to lift up the very, very important principle of no coercion.
Yeah.
Right now, we've been having a lot of discussion about restorative justice, at least in our New York City community. And, you know, when it starts to get mixed up with the criminal legal and with the paradigm that undergirds that system, it's understandable why people would be concerned about using restorative justice and feeling that it was going to be coerced. So we have to really be clear that coercion is not part of restorative justice. And that we also need to take a lot of time in our processes. I think it's very, very labor intensive. I think Danny was talking about, you know, having different kinds of group, but it has to be a very thoughtful process in which we're willing to go on for a year or a year and a half, working in a restorative way, and hopefully in a transformative community accountability way, you know, as we're doing it. So that's in general.
To that end, would somebody mind offering up maybe even an experience, or, you know, of what a restorative justice process might look like? And Danny had mentioned, for example, circles and healing circles. What does that mean? Where do we get it from? And, you know, to honor this one, I was at a panel for a law school last weekend, and somebody asked, but would the language that they used was, would the perpetrator even want to do that? Like, what's the point if they're not? What if they don't want to change? You know, which I think is a big question that gets asked, right? Like, how good can this be if the abusive partner isn't being coerced into being accountable, or what might be perceived as accountability? So I'm sorry, that was a lot of questions. Let me just go back to what was the example? An example of restorative justice in a healing circle.
So I could share an experience when I was in a preventive program. I facilitated a parenting workshop, and a parenting workshop it was based on a curriculum that we designed that has that considered the cultural traditions and values that took it into account. And then in that workshop, we tried to have people we had parents, mothers, and also we had the dads as well in the workshop. At the first two sessions, it was very challenging because, again, it wasn't the same family. It was completely different families that were in the same space. But at the first two sessions, there was a lot of mistrust in the group. You know, why I'm here, what is it that needs to be done, and what the outcome of it. However, after some sessions, then the people start hearing each other, start hearing the stories of the other person, and completely the atmosphere changed. And then we got to a point that people were really opening up, talking about their experience, talking about the challenges that got them to actually be where they are, and help them understand the other person. They help them understand the other. They help them understand that we all go through experiences in life. And again, I go back to your point, Margarita. If a person is not willing to change, you can't make them change. That period. the first person has to understand and that admit that there's something wrong. If you want me to change and I keep saying I did nothing wrong, there's nothing wrong, then we can't get anywhere.
Right.
That's
Right.
an experience that actually was very successful. At the end of the session, the workshop, they wished that we filmed that workshop, and that came from the group. And it was actually personally, it was a very great learning experience for me.
Thank you. Thank you. Sally or Nancy, would either of you like to offer an experience or an example of a restorative justice practice?
Well, we did mention the healing circle, but also part of the healing circles is to bring all sides together, to have the individual frame the type of intervention, what would be acceptable versus not acceptable. There are many situations in which a survivor of domestic violence would say to us, stay with us, stay with our family. If you stay within our family, the abuse will not continue. I don't know whether this is flirting with the idea of restorative justice because it keeps us in the lives of the individuals, but it was understood that the interventions that we were working with them were healing the family. In that also matching the family members with other healthy families that they could be mentors or they coach one another, especially the men being examples to one another. I remember in a situation when we were doing interventions with a family in which we all gathered in the mosque. And the imam was a little bit pushing that the family get together in return for the man to return to the home. And that's when we had to do some advocacy to say, you know, the survivor is not feeling comfortable that the man needs to come back, not yet. And so as the imam understood all the things that the woman was going through, he actually offered that the other men who are part of the healing circle can work and mentor with the man who is being abusive. In situations like that, we need to be able to work outside of ourselves and work with the rest of the service providers, faith-based organizations, the safety net. There's another situation prior to even coming to the Arab American Family Support Center in which I was working with an imam, and the imam said to me, it's time to activate the goon squad. I was like, what is the goon squad? And he said, that's when our brothers talk to the brother that's doing the abuse or inflicting pain on our sister, and they have a conversation with him. We remind him why he needs to be a man, he needs to be a protector, he needs to be an honest human being and not take advantage.
My little man of love.
So vulnerable and here by herself, and he's taking advantage of her. No, we need to have a conversation with him. And that's when they have a serious conversation with him to say, dude, you're not doing the right thing by your wife, by your children, by your family. And time to shape up.
Right, right. Those are really great examples. Thank you so much, Nancy. And not to be committed to any particular definition, but it reminds me a lot of the language we just heard about connected people coming together to transform and heal within that connection, right? Like within that particular context. And Sally, I don't know if there's anything you want to add right now. I can offer up another sort of aspirational practice, which is to say, for our clients very often here at the Violence Intervention Program, there is not an existing community necessarily that they're coming to, right? So they're coming pretty isolated. There may be some connections they can make. Those might be connections that they don't trust or they don't know very well or that they're still building. So as an option of something that would be not coercive, and this is not something that the violence intervention program does now. Let me be very clear. Don't start making referrals for this practice. We don't have the capacity for this. This is thinking forward about how a program like ours, which is VAWA funded, mandated reporting, and has all of these sort of state engagements that we believe can ultimately be really harmful to communities of color and immigrants, how we might create practices that are about transformation within communities and for the people that we work with. So one thing that I would be really interested in exploring with within our program with our colleagues is for people who don't have, right, like in the case that you offered, Nancy, a sort of faith-based community with strong leadership that is going to either be aligned from the beginning or can become aligned with a process that really works to heal from this sort of violence, how we might hold space, how we might create that community here outside of the threat of going to jail, of getting ACS called, of all of immigration being called, and hold some sort of circle or process that happens within this culturally specific organization. And not necessarily amongst people who know each other well, right? Like it might be the first time that person meets with us. But to Nancy's earlier point, we have people coming to us for assistance because of cultural familiarity. And there's a trust that comes with that, that they're not feeling anywhere else. So they're not going to go anywhere else for help. So if we can think and innovate and imagine what community transformation looks like from this vantage point, then we're offering another option to what should be a myriad sort of list of opportunities that people might have to address violence that was enacted against them. And I wanted also to, Judith Levine offers up a really great question on the conversation about coercion and restorative justice. So I want to turn to that really quick. So right now, and what Judith is talking about is how restorative justice often gets presented as an alternative to incarceration, as opposed to a different process with a different entry point. So in a situation where restorative justice is another form of alternative to incarceration, you're already system involved, and they say you can go through this restorative process or you can go through the regular sort of practice of motions and trials to get through this situation after somebody's been arrested. How do we address, how do we reconcile that? How is restorative justice then non-coercive? And I know that was something Sally had been speaking to, but we just lost her again. So I'll float that conversation to Danny and to Nancy, and then I'm happy to take a crack at it after that as well.
Again, like I said, it's very currently our so I can't speak about what the court is doing, whether they would say it is you have this RJ option, go and do it, and then that would you wouldn't go to jail if you do the RJ practice. But I wouldn't call it RJ specifically, because it will, when RJ is being implemented or any additional options to incarceration is being implemented, it should be studied. It should be communities should be taken into account. Practices, indigenous practices or community practices should be taken into account. So right now, it is very hard to say it's not being, when it's open, when it is an additional option, it's going to vary. It depends on who is implementing that option. Is it a community-based organization implementing that option, or a court that's implementing that option? And completely is going to have different practices or different definitions and different implementations.
Okay. So, go ahead, Nancy. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and also I cannot emphasize enough that it is very, very important for us to learn from the experience. so that we are able to document what's working, what's not working, and how can we tweak it and moderate it so that it is suitable and others can learn from that experience. I think the current process system, funding sources do not allow for that kind of reflection, and does not the documentation, the evaluation process is not very well designed or set up to for us to learn from the experience. And so there isn't one place that we could point to or one study that we could point to that would say, aha, this intervention has worked with this population in this community. Because yes, it's our aspiration, it is, but it cannot be one size fits all. There has to be some tweaking taken into consideration, because we are dealing with human beings that are coming to us in different places in their immigration journey, in their abilities, in their skill sets, in the resources that they have and don't have, and what they're going through in the circumstances that they're going through them. So it is very, very important for us to allow ourselves the ability to document when things are going right and when things are going wrong, and for us to learn from what is going wrong or what did not work. Let that be a teacher for all of us, so that others can learn. And that's part of our responsibility as service providers.
Right. So really quick, the answer I'm hearing to Judith's question, which I would agree with, is if coercion is involved and or if it's offered as an alternative to incarceration, that's not something that this group of people who is having in this conversation would necessarily define as restorative justice. Right. It might be that phrase might be used by a court system to describe the process that they're offering as an alternative to incarceration. But yes, Judith, we agree that because it's just an alternative to a criminal legal system that's already started, doesn't necessarily qualify under our working definition here as something that could be non-coercive. And then I also wanted to add to Nancy's point about sort of the one-size-fits-all version of events, which is what we have right now with the criminal legal system. There's only one way to go through it, right? There's only one process that's going to get folks, to achieve an outcome through that system. And about over-relying on that template, right? Universal answer is that you then really create an opportunity that we have seen gets capitalized upon. You answer the one option that is available to you, and becomes really part of our victim blaming culture, right? So if an order of protection is the only thing you can do to try to create some sort of process of accountability or transformation in your relationship, and you don't go for the order of protection, then I think the answer that you hear or the commentary you get from people is, well, why didn't you go get the order of protection? As though then maybe what you're experiencing is invalidated. And is just not really what you're saying it is. We saw that actually in the recent hearings for Christine Blasey Ford, Dr. Ford, when survivors of sexual assault were confronting the GOP and lawmakers in the hallways, Mitch McConnell, one of them was saying, like, I went through the same thing as a young person, as a young girl. And Mitch McConnell was like, I'm really sorry, you should have reported to the police, right? So when that is the only option available, it plays into a victim blaming culture to say, like, well, you didn't do what you're supposed to do, so it's really your fault, right? And what we're talking about with regards to these different options is really exploring and exploding the notion that there is only one way for you to validate your experience of violence, and there's only one way for that experience to be seen, recognized, and addressed. And that is what we're trying to combat here. That is what I think we're trying to move forward around. And we had lost Sally, and I haven't seen her come back yet. We have about 5 minutes left, so I wanted to see if there were any additional questions we might answer for folks.
And there's a fire drill in my home. And I'm supposed to be out. I found out it was just a drill, but
I hope it's just a drill.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay, no problem. We were just saying there's 5 minutes left, and we were looking to see if there were any questions from the folks who are listening on the webinar for us to close out with. And if, as I'm waiting for any questions to come through there, I'll ask the folks involved in the conversation if you have anything else that you want to say, or like reflecting back to something you said earlier or that somebody else said that you wanted to respond to.
Yeah, I end promptly at 2 because we use this time around people's lunchtime. So Law at the Margins is also about action. And so maybe if we could end out with maybe one call to action, or, you know, ways in which we could support each of your work, that would be really helpful. And then we can end with there. And I do want to sort of share kind of next steps. We see this as a collaborative effort. This program was as a result of co-sponsors, Margarita sort of really leading us, and Danny, Nancy, and Sally, so everyone giving their time. And so I do want to take a little bit of time at the end to, you know, think about what we could offer as next steps. But maybe we can hear as to call to action, like what is one thing that we could do as a community to support each of your and lift up your work.
Thank you. Maybe a combination of call to action, and also just wanted to make sure I had plugged some more information for people who are, because I think, you know, some folks we're all looking for training on this, believe me, so are we. There aren't a lot of answers out there in the form of a training. Mm-hmm. There's really just answers through process and exploration. And so one additional tool I would offer to your exploration of these conversations is creative interventions, which was work that was led by Mimi Kim on the West Coast. And it's like a 400-page guideline, but you don't have to read all 400 pages of it to get a really great understanding and appreciation of what it might look like if you wanted to address intimate partner and/or sexual violence within communities. And so it's called Creative Interventions, a Toolkit. And if you were to Google creative interventions, you'll find it. So I wanted to offer that. And in that spirit, a call to action would be to please, thank you for that link, would be to please make sure that you're continuing this conversation in your workplace, like in wherever it is that you engage this work, whether it's work or with friends or in your family, that you're asking, you know, like, are we really doing everything we can? Because I promise you the answer is no. You know, like I do this work full time all the time, and the answer is still no from me. So to please consider what ways we can talk about this within community to move this conversation
that's
forward.
What I would add also, that for us to keep thinking about this and looking at the ways that our own thinking has been shaped by the current paradigm, and try to move, you know, just be open and curious, and keep our eyes open for the ways that we're not doing justice to the people who are suffering.
I would like to add 3 things that we could do. That is continuously work with others, like-minded organization, similar in mission, goals, and objectives, who are working in the same field, to coordinate, cooperate, collaborate on a continuous basis, so that we already have an infrastructure, a safety net of services that our clients can tap into on a regular basis, because there is not one organization that's going to be able to fulfill all the needs that a family may require at any given time. That's one call to action. The other call to action is to speak truth to power. For example, in some situations in which one is offered funding, or there's an RFP out there that would not work for your organization, is you need to speak up and say the truth and say why it will not work for the population that you are serving. That is the best way you could honor those that are feeling their voices are not being heard. The third way I would say is to include the clients that you are serving in the design of your programs. I cannot imagine having a program in place without the feedback and the constructive feedback and the critical information that one can have from their clients. So I would say those are three things that I cannot emphasize enough to all that are listening.
Yeah.
Great. Margarita, did you want to add any closing thoughts? If not, I'll just close us out. Law at the Margins is extremely happy to facilitate this conversation. I want to thank all those who participated live. We have about 97 registered. This conversation is recorded, and you can share the link and people can watch replays. It will sit on the platform. You're welcome to share this training and conversation as well. So I wanted to thank our co-sponsors who are Selected for South Asian Women, Mujeres, as well as SOAR for Justice. They're not been sort of visible, but have been sort of instrumental in this program. And of course, our wonderful speakers, Sally, Danny, and Nancy. So I hope that we can be a sort of a platform that each of you can see as facilitating the conversations. If there are things that you would like us to continue, we're more than happy to continue this collaboration. And I think the last point I wanted to make, one thing that struck out at me is the enormous amount of lack of resources and funding for these alternative methods. Earlier, Margarita shared the statistics about the number of resources that actually go to the criminal legal approaches, and how most of you, are really not finding the resources for the innovative approaches that actually help our community. So I encourage all of the participants to fund community-based organizations. What I took away from this is that if we fund community-based organizations and organizing efforts, we actually also deal with the issue around intimate partner violence. And so I think as an organizer at heart, but lawyer by training, ultimately it seems strong communities are safe communities, and that we don't really need the legal or the sort of enforcement structure to do that. That was my powerful takeaway, and I encourage everyone to support the organizations that are here, Connect NYC, Arab American Family Support Center, as well as Deputy Mujeres. And there are many other organizations that we're happy to share with you that have a community-based approach. Let's support them and lift them up through our resources and spread their work. With that, I'm really honored to be able to sort of sit and learn, and I look forward to collaborating with everyone that's here today. We will share the participant list with the speakers. So because we don't believe in, we really believe in community building. If any of the participants do not want their information shared, I also want to respect that. Please let us know at lawatthemargins@gmail.com. And finally, behind the scenes is Albert Garcia. He's our tech producer, and I just want to give him a shout out. We never see him, but he's the kind of hand that guides us. All right, well, have a wonderful rest of the afternoon and weekend. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.